Is that really the plan, General? Do you honestly think this old woman is going to fix with this nonsense what our entire team of engineers couldn't solve with real science? Ada Vance, the chief engineer at the airbase, couldn't hide the sarcasm in her voice as she watched Eleanor Hartwell walk toward the F-35 Lightning II, grounded for days with an engine failure. A critical mission depending on it coming back to life. But what happened next would leave the entire team of engineers wondering who this woman really was and how she managed to pull it off. Ada Vance crossed her arms and shook her head as if watching a scene that would only delay the schedule even further. The engineers around her, mostly young, some holding tablets, others checking monitors connected to the F-35 system, tried to hide their doubtful glances. Deep down, though, they all shared the same question. What could this elderly woman walking slowly possibly add when even we, the specialists, hadn't found the fault? Eleanor Hartwell, with the marks of time etched on her face, wasn't intimidated by the atmosphere. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied the imposing jet. The F-35 Lightning II, one of the most advanced fighters, sat in silence, except for the hum of auxiliary equipment. The aircraft seemed to mock the situation. So much cutting-edge technology, yet everyone was held hostage by a detail no one could uncover. General Patricia Prescott remained still, observing. She wasn't entirely convinced this would work, but she had no other option. Her stern expression masked the nerves she refused to admit. She had authorized Eleanor's presence, remembering the stories from when the veteran worked on the test line of the Pratt & Amp Whitney F-135 engine, the very heart of the aircraft before them. Prescott knew the decision sounded strange, maybe even reckless, but time was the enemy now. A critical mission depended on this fighter taking off, and every last minute was a threat to the operation. Get started, Prescott ordered, trying to keep authority in front of the team. Eleanor stepped closer to the open compartment where cables and sensors were still connected. She ran her hand along the fuselage as if greeting an old friend. To many, it looked like theater. To her, it was respect. You really believe you're going to hear something our systems didn't catch? Ada sneered, her smile crooked. Eleanor took a deep breath. The jab didn't bother her. She had faced skepticism before, decades earlier, when the F-135 prototypes had shown mysterious failures that left young, confident engineers baffled. Now, it seemed time had only repeated the scene. Different faces, same kind of problem. In a low but firm voice, she said, "Start up again. Standard procedure, no adjustments." There was a brief silence. Ada rolled her eyes, but Prescott cut in. Do what she said. Two technicians exchanged looks and set up the control panel. One of them confirmed the safety sequence and engaged the electric start system. The initial were filled to space, rising to the point where the engine should have caught. But as before, nothing, just inert rotations. The engine turned, but wouldn't ignite. While the engineers stared at their monitors, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She tilted her head slightly as if every shift in rotation was a word in a language only she understood. She stepped closer and placed her hand on an external fuel line, feeling the vibration. The detail was almost imperceptible, but her expression changed. Not to surprise, but recognition. "Again," she said. Ada scoffed. "This is pointless. We're wasting time." But Prescott raised her hand, silent, ordering the team to obey. Second attempt. The word returned, and Eleanor, now with eyes open, leaned in to listen. Her hand remained steady on the tubing. When the rotation suddenly dropped, she raised a finger, cutting the process short. "Enough. Shut it down." The hangar went silent, broken only by the cooling engine and the distant sounds of other base operations. The engineers watched her with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Eleanor adjusted her jacket and turned to Prescott. "The problem isn't in the main sensors. It's in the secondary fuel control valve. Internal deposits are interfering with the fuel flow regulation." Ada almost laughed. "That's unlikely. None of our diagnostics showed anything in that area." Prescott, now more focused, leaned toward the chief engineer. "Ada, check the valve." "General, with all due respect, it's a waste of time." "Check it now." "That's an order." Ada took a deep breath, clearly irritated. She nodded and signaled to the team. Two engineers began removing the side access panel to reach the component. It was delicate work done under dozens of watchful eyes. Silence filled the hangar as everyone waited to see the outcome of this gamble. Eleanor stood nearby, quietly watching. She wasn't in a rush. She knew what she was waiting for. The scene reminded her of years long past. Minutes later, one of the technicians exclaimed, "General, there are deposits inside." Ada's eyes widened. She rushed over to see for herself and spotted the dark buildup clogging the valve. It was subtle, but enough to compromise ignition. The silence was broken by Prescott. "Clean it and recalibrate the actuator." The team moved quickly. Parts were soaked in solution, scrubbed carefully, dried, and inspected one by one. The tension grew with every minute because they all knew the mission depended on this result. As the cleaning continued, Ada approached Eleanor. There was a sting of wounded pride in her voice. "Have you done this before?" Eleanor met her eyes. "Once, back when the F-135 was still a prototype. It would choke and no one could figure out why. We spent weeks until we found deposits like these. Since then, I've learned to recognize the sound." Ada took a deep breath. She didn't know if she was more upset with the situation or with herself. While the engineers worked, she cast a brief glance at Eleanor, who said nothing. She simply stood still, watching the engine like a woman who knew the battle was about to end. A few minutes later, the valve was reinstalled and the system prepared again. The team waited for authorization. Eleanor stepped forward. "Now try it again." Ada drew in a deep breath, crossed her arms, and kept watching. She wanted to see failure to prove her point. But what came next would change how everyone in that hangar saw the woman standing before them. The hangar was almost silent. Only the faint hiss of support equipment and the distant echo of footsteps against the metal structure broke the tension. Every eye was fixed on the control panel and the Pratt & Amp Whitney F-135 engine. The order had been clear. Try again. The initial were filled to space. The engine began to spin, the rotations climbing steadily. The panel showed parameters within normal range. Ada's eyes darted across the numbers, scanning frantically. Prescott, motionless, just waited. Eleanor, eyes half closed, tilted her head as if each shift in sound was a word in a secret language. Her hand stayed firm on the outer tubing, feeling the vibration. Suddenly, she raised her arm. "Shut it down." The technician froze, but Prescott repeated the order. "Cut it." The engine slowed into silence. A murmur of confusion rippled through the team. Ada exploded. "What the hell now?" Eleanor turned to her calmly. "Because it's not ready yet. The flow needs to settle. If you push it now, you risk damaging the actuator." Ada scoffed, annoyed. "That's intuition, not science." "Call it what you want," Eleanor replied. "But if you try again now, the engine will fail once more." Prescott looked at them both and made her decision. "We wait." Silence fell again. Time dragged on, each second a mix of expectation and doubt. Some engineers whispered among themselves, torn between the logic of the numbers and Eleanor's quiet authority. After a few adjustments to the valve, the veteran finally took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Now it's ready. Try again." Ada closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing for another disappointment. The technician waited only for Prescott's final confirmation. The general gave a nod. The button was pressed. The electric system responded immediately. The same where that had ended in failure so many times before filled the hangar with tension. The rotations climbed higher and higher. The monitors tracked the progress with precision. Everyone waited for the moment the engine would finally reveal its fate. Eleanor kept her hand steady on the fuselage, listening to every vibration, every shift in frequency. Her face remained focused. And then it came. A deep roar shook the hangar. It wasn't the hollow spin of past attempts, but the true awakening of the engine. The low rumble reverberated through the walls, pressing against every chest in the room. The engineers looked at each other in disbelief, as if none of them could trust what they were hearing. Ada Vance, who had kept her arms crossed, slowly unfolded them, her eyes wide and locked on the engine. The F-135 was alive, its contained power making it clear it was ready for more. Eleanor Hartwell stood still beside the aircraft, calm as if she had seen this moment before. To her, it wasn't surprise, just confirmation. Her hand still rested on the fuselage. "It's working," one of the engineers whispered, barely believing it. Prescott stepped forward, her hard face softened by relief. For a general accustomed to results, that moment meant more than fixing a problem. It was proof her decision to trust Eleanor had been right. Ada, however, wrestled with her wounded pride. She walked to the auxiliary panel, checked the readings on her portable monitor, and finally admitted, "Yeah, it's in the ideal range." The words came out low, each syllable heavy. Eleanor then stepped back a few paces, and without raising her voice said, "Internal deposits. If they hadn't been removed, we would have lost more time." There was a plainness to her words, almost unsettling for those who leaned on reports and graphs. The engine kept running for a few more minutes, until Prescott firmly signaled to cut it. The sound faded, leaving only the echo and the heavy silence that follows something monumental. The silence itself was almost as powerful as the roar had been. Everyone seemed to be absorbing what they had just witnessed. The general then turned to the team. "Prepare the fighter. It's flying today." Movement was immediate. Technicians rushed to disconnect the monitoring cables, remove the support equipment, and run through the final safety checks. The tension from earlier in the day had shifted into something else. Now everyone was driven by the same purpose: to get the Lightning II in the air. Eleanor walked aside of the hangar, watching in silence. Her slow steps contrasted with the rush of the younger workers. It was as if she belonged to another time, yet remained essential to the present moment. One of the engineers, visibly impressed, finally broke the silence. "But how did you notice that?" Eleanor turned her gaze to the young woman and answered calmly, "The engine speaks. You just have to know how to listen." The phrase lingered in the air, simple yet loaded with meaning. To the younger ones, it sounded almost like a riddle Ada couldn't hold back. "Listen, with all due respect, Ms. Hartwell, that sounds like luck." Prescott stepped in firmly. "What matters is that she solved it." Ada drew a long breath and looked away. To her, this was a personal defeat. In front of her own team, she was forced to recognize that the veteran had done in minutes what days of work hadn't achieved. Minutes later, the team finished the final adjustments to ensure the engine was fully operational. The atmosphere inside the hangar had shifted. Where there had once been skepticism, now there was respect, even if unspoken. Prescott walked up to Eleanor. "Hartwell, I owe you more than thanks. This mission would have been compromised without your help." The veteran simply inclined her head, not seeking praise. "I only did what I've always done, General." Preparation for takeoff began immediately. Technicians disconnected the auxiliary cables, removed the support equipment, and ran to the last safety checks. The aircraft, once dead weight, was now alive again, ready for the sky. Ada, still uneasy, gathered the courage to address Eleanor. "I admit, without you, we never would have found that. I owe you an apology. I underestimated your experience." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She just looked at the chief engineer for a few seconds before saying, "I accept your apology. Let's move forward." Once everything was ready, the F-35 was towed to the runway. Prescott made sure Eleanor accompanied the movement. The veteran walked slowly, but her eyes carried the same brightness they had decades earlier when she first saw the Lightning IIs come to life. At the edge of the runway, the group stopped. The assigned pilot climbed into the cockpit, adjusted the controls, and prepared for the real startup. Eleanor stayed close, watching every detail as if it were part of her. At Prescott's signal, the engine was fired again. This time, there was no hesitation. The roar of the F-135 filled the air with authority, leaving no doubt it was ready to fly. The fighter rolled slowly down the runway, building speed. The power was visible, the wheels pounding the ground until, with a surge, the aircraft lifted. The F-35 climbed with majesty, cutting through the sky as the engine's thunder echoed across the base. Eleanor followed it with her eyes until the jet became nothing but a distant point. There was something symbolic in that moment. For many, it was just a machine doing its job. For Eleanor, it was proof her knowledge still had a place in this world. Proof that the bond between woman and machine, forged over decades, still endured. Back at the base, among the engineers. Conversations about what had just happened began to stir. Prescott broke the silence, her voice low but firm enough for all to hear. That sound in the sky carries your signature, Hartwell. The general stepped closer. The woman who usually wore a hardened expression, accustomed to fast decisions and no room for error, seemed different. There was pride in her eyes, but also humility. Hartwell, I could pin a medal on you for this. Maybe you don't realize how much we needed this result today. Eleanor smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. I never needed medals, General. I just needed to prove I could still be useful. The word struck everyone present. Many were young, still to start their careers, and they realized that one day they too would reach Eleanor's age. What would matter then wouldn't be titles, but the certainty that their contributions still lived on. The general nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. Night began to fall over the airbase. The runway lights came alive, and the cold wind swept through the open space. Eleanor adjusted her worn coat, and without fanfare started walking away. She didn't seek applause. She didn't expect speeches. For her, the true tribute had already been given, the roar of the engine in the sky. As Eleanor slowly walked out of the hangar, each step echoed with symbolic weight. She didn't need to be present at ceremonies or in headlines. She was already etched in the memory of those who witnessed this moment. She was in the mission the fighter had just carried out. And for anyone watching, whether a young engineer, a general, or even someone with no ties to aviation, the story carried a simple but powerful lesson. Never dismiss the experience of those who have lived long enough to earn it. Time may age the body, but it never erases wisdom.